Okay, welcome everyone to the next video in the series Complete Rook Endgames from Chess.com. This is FM Daniel Wrench speaking. Today what we're going to do is going to get started off with one of the more difficult drawing ideas. Once you've covered some of the basic positions, the Lucena winning method, and then the basic Filroy drawing method, we start to get to some positions that get a little bit more complex, and but nonetheless, you should still be aware of all your drawing possibilities and all the different techniques out there, not just for your own ability to draw, but also if you're the one trying to win these positions and your opponent seems to have an idea of what the drawing methods are. Always good to know little tricks to try to throw them off. Okay, so let's jump right in. Here what we have is the beginning position of king on short side, rook on long side. Now, the idea here is going to, obviously, white wants to continue to progress this pawn and get a queen at some point. And the way that he typically does that is by finding a way to get the king in front of the pawn and transferring the rook back behind, hence the Lucena, one of the first ideas we covered in this series. But what we're going to see here is that sometimes these positions, even if you can't get the basic Filroy drawing method, for example, if this position were black to move, he would simply bring the rook up to the 6th rank, cutting it off, and we would have a Filroy draw. However, this position is white to move, and so white's going to start out by bringing his king forward in that awkward position where we have a bad choice to make. We can no longer give this check, trying to get a Filroy, because after he pushes the pawn, checkmate is threatened, so we have no time to come around and start checking the Filroy idea again. So we would be forced to coming down and stopping the checkmate, after which the rook would simply slide over and we're immediately lost. This is a basic idea we covered in the end of our second video, actually, but continuing on with it here today. So let's start. So white's going to bring the king forward, and the idea is pretty simple. He wants to either create checkmate threats or find a way to force the king out from in front of the pawn so that he can achieve the Lucena position. Now, our problem is, as I just said, is we can't give this check. So basically, the only move here you're going to see for black is to give the check from the rear, which doesn't look like a bad move at first, but once he hides behind the pawn, all of a sudden we realize what trouble we're in with the king. Now, I've seen this position reached in many games and many different levels, and you'd be surprised how many times people just don't know this idea that we're going to cover today, which is that your king belongs on the short side of the pawn. Now, you heard me say king on short side, rook on long side, and that's what I mean. Wherever this pawn is, you have a short side of the board and a long side of the board. Now, what's going to make this endgame a little bit difficult, you're going to see, is that sometimes, even if your rook is on the long side, you're not able to draw, and that's what we're going to cover next. But to start out, what we're going to see is that if black understands the idea of bringing the king to this side of the board, and white gives check to try to force the king out, we still have enough room on this side of the pawn to draw. And this is how. When the king comes forward, we can transfer our rook up by giving check and immediately coming over to the long side. Now, the reason why it's important for your rook to be as far away from the king as possible is because when he starts pushing this pawn, you need to be able to give these checks and make sure that he can't attack the rook without leaving the pawn. So if he wants to come after your rook, he's going to have to leave the pawn behind. Sometimes for the rook to capture immediately, like if you move the king here, you'd obviously take. But sometimes, even if he just strays too far from the pawn, your king may have a chance to come forward. So what we're going to see here is that when he comes forward and we give this check, as long as we understand the idea of bringing the king over to the long side of the board, we're going to be in good shape. Bring the king over to the short side of the board, we're going to be in good shape. He gives check, we come up, he continues to try to make progress. It should be noted that if he tried to make progress in another way, you're still able to draw this position by giving a check or even immediately transferring over to the long side, because he still has the problem that when he tries to come forward and your rook begins giving checks, his king can't get to your rook without leaving the pawn. A funny way to say this would be that if the board was an endless chessboard, there are many rook endings, probably almost all of them, that would just be infinite draws, because if the rook could stay as far away from the king as possible and continue to give checks, there would never be a way for white to really make progress. So again, we see that when these checks start to be given, he can't get to the rook without leaving the pawn. So our key idea to remember is to transfer the king to the short side, leaving the rook with the opportunity, either by coming over right away or by this check method here, to transfer back over to the long side. Now, I wish I could say, boys and girls, that it was that easy, but unfortunately it's not, because your opponent may know some other tricks. For example, one of the tricks here is to try this move. Again, we mentioned this idea at the end of our second video, and that is that when we give these checks, he's going to try to block. You'll notice that the trade of rooks immediately goes into a lost king and pawn ending, because his king is in perfect position. So the question is, what do we do when we're waiting? How do we wait in this endgame once he's brought this rook up to stop the checks? Well, there's a key phrase that goes along with these king on short side, rook on long side drawing techniques. I don't know if it's a phrase out there, but it's a phrase I kind of invented for my students, and that is called, we wait on the eighth. And I like it because it rhymes, so it's easy to remember. When you're waiting with this rook, you wait on the eighth. And that's the most useful place for the rook to wait for a number of reasons. First one being that if you were to move your rook elsewhere, and he was to push the pawn, at some point, if he was to move this king with a discovered check, where would he want to move the king for a discovered check? Away from the pawn or in front of the pawn to get a Lucina? Well, obviously, he wants to put the king in front of the pawn so that he can reach a Lucina position. This endgame would now be lost for black. So by waiting on the eighth, already we stop this king from giving discovered checks on our king by going to the eighth rank, which helps. The other reason is actually pretty obvious. The other reason is that as his pawn gets closer to getting a queen, the most optimal place to guard that is by guarding the queening square. So if he were to push the pawn, as we saw with our last move, our move would be to bring the king forward, and already we're in an easy draw-in position. The rook can wait along the eighth rank, and he's in a little bit of a zugzwang here almost, even though he's winning, because if he ever moves the rook off, trying to come around and check, we're going to start giving checks with our rook, and you can see for yourselves that his choices are either A, to give up the pawn, or to try to trade rooks, which after we would trade would give up the pawn again. So once we bring our king forward, as long as we're waiting on the eighth, he doesn't really have the option to move the rook away. Now, he can push the pawn, but again, our rook is in the optimal position already, guarding the square, so our king needs only to come back, and white has no way to make progress in this position. He's stuck. He can't trade rooks because your king will win the pawn at the end of a trade. If a trade happens on c8, your king will win the pawn. He can't move the rook along the eighth rank. Well, actually, I guess he could, but again, any move with the rook along the eighth rank is actually a draw here. Probably the most simple would be a threat to take the pawn, forcing his king to move, and then just go ahead and go right back, reminding him that there's no progress to be made. One little good trick to be aware of would be that if white tried to move the rook down, hoping that after this check and king move that you were to take the pawn, you don't need to take the pawn. You don't need to take the pawn and allow him this check, followed by check here, winning the rook. Once he's established, once he's allowed your king this close to the pawn, if his rook moves anywhere, all you really need to do is give checks until kingdom come. Check him, check him, check him, check him, and his choices are either going to be to trade rooks, which will give you the pawn open, or eventually to move the king away, which also avoids any tricks of him winning your rook. Okay, so I think we start off a little bit fast and furious here, so let's slow down for a second and make sure that we're getting all these ideas pat. The most important thing to remember, even if you forget other things, is that when Philidor fails, if it happened to be your opponent's move here, and like I said, you were unable to bring your rook up, guarding the sixth rank and creating the easy Philidor draw, when these positions occur, the next most practical and most useful drawing method to know is that little phrase, king on short side, rook on long side. Don't want to forget it. When you get these positions where you have to make a decision with your king of which side of the board to run to, always remember that the short side of the pawn is the best, even if you're lost anyway. We're going to get to a position next where you might even be lost anyway, but your best drawing chances, your most practical drawing chances always happen to be with your king on the short side, rook on the long side. So we see white checking and trying to come forward, and either way, any way he wants to do it. Don't be worried about extra checks here, kids, because extra checks don't do anything. At some point, he's got to try to move this king either out of the way or forward, you know, to try to advance the pawn. And when he does that, we immediately take advantage of our newfound knowledge of king on short side, rook on long side. Once we get that rook over to the long side, our drawing method is pretty simple. The obvious idea of pushing does not work because the king cannot get close enough to the rook without leaving the pawn, as we see from this check. And the more tricky idea of trying to offer a king and pawn ending doesn't really work either, because we're going to remember our favorite phrase, which is wait on the 8th. It rhymes, so we don't want to forget it. Again, if he pushes the pawn, we have no need to worry, because as soon as our king gets one step away from the pawn, whether it be on the 6th or 7th rank, white has reached a little bit of a conundrum, because he cannot move the rook away without allowing a series of checks leading to either a perpetual or the loss of the pawn. And any other waiting ideas don't really work. Let's see. Well, what if he moves the king with a discovered check? Well, moving the king with a discovered check is not going to do much as long as we are smart enough to bring our king back in front of the pawn. If you moved your king away and kept your king away from the pawn, you're going to increase your chances of losing here. You want to keep your king as close to in front of the pawn as possible. And again, let's say if he tried to transfer now already you'd be giving a check, and guess what you're in here? A Philidor, the first position we ever learned to draw. We have him cut off along the 6th rank, and if he ever pushes, we come back down with a number of checks, again, to follow, to draw. So there really isn't any other tricks to be aware of besides knowing that the king and pawn ending is lost for you if you trade there. And as he tries to make progress, we remember to bring our king that one step closer. We eventually reach the position where the king and the rook are guarding the queening square, and white has no way to make progress but to wait and to hope that we fall asleep or choke on a sandwich or something. And as long as neither one of those things happens, he will eventually try to move the rook and hope for a trick. He will eventually try to move the rook away. Let's see. He'll try to move the rook away and hope for a trick. Hope for you to take the pawn, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to keep giving checks until the game is over. So, okay, very good. This is the first and I think most critical position for understanding the king on short side and rook on long side. Now, as promised, I said I was going to show you a position where that idea, even as important as it is to know, is actually not good enough. And surprisingly, the only thing I've changed from this position to the original one we just started out with, you may notice, is the positions of the rooks. This would be a moment where we might recommend for you to take a second and see if you can figure out why just the simple transfer of the rook, the white rook now being on the A file and the black rook on the B file, makes all the difference in the world. Okay? Okay, we're going to assume that you took your pause there, and now you're back, and let's move on forward. So as white starts to make progress, just as he did in the last position, we give our check because we have no other choice, and we run with our king to the short side because we're smart, and we know that's the best idea. However, just the fact that he controls the A file rather than the B file is going to be enough for him to win. Because as he makes progress, and we transfer our rook to the long side, you may notice something. The long side of the pawn isn't so long anymore when he controls the A file. Again, another reason why that funny idea I mentioned in the first video, that if it was an endless board, you would almost never have a problem drawing a rook ending, because if your rook could go as far away from the king as possible, he would almost never be able to stop your checks. But in this position already, we see that by giving our two checks, he gets here, and when we were normally able to come to A6 check, leaving him with that problem that he can't get close enough to the rook without leaving the pawn, he now no longer has that problem. We have problems. So we try to bring our rook in front of the pawn and hold for as long as possible, but immediately we're lost. Defense with the king loses the rook, and moving the rook over loses to queen. We can give checks, but he'll move away, and the game is over. So let's look at that again. So the question really becomes, if it's so simple as what file a rook controls. I know for me, I had trouble understanding rook endings for a long time because it seems like such a trivial thing to control. Very hard to control something like that in a practical game. Funny way to look at it is, I know that I've lost many theoretical draws to Grandmasters players better than me because even if I had my rook on the A file to start with, maybe he does a series of weird, tricky moves that don't work the first time, and so he does the same series of weird, tricky moves again, and they don't work the second time. But then the third time, all of a sudden, we're both under 5 minutes, and he does it again in just a way that looks a little bit differently. Suddenly, you give him the A file. He comes forward, and you think you're doing the same idea, and you realize that you've lost the theoretically drawn position. So, indeed, there really isn't a perfect recipe for making sure you can always draw with king on short side, rook on long side. Still the best thing for you to know next to the Philidor draw, cutting them off in the 6th rank. But as I said, not necessarily a guaranteed draw to cut them off along the, or not necessarily a guaranteed draw to transfer the rook to the long side, especially if the long side is not so long, given the position where your opponent had the A file. So some fundamentals to remember from this are a few things. First of all, the first thing we said in the beginning, that your drawing chances will be greatly increased just from knowing that phrase, king on short side, rook on long side. It's your only chance, and transferring the king to the long side will lead you directly to a Lucena position where you will lose. So you have to know that idea just to have a chance. Now, generally, the long side is enough. If we were talking about a bishop pawn, the long side, it would be enough, even if it was a B file or A file for your rook. To show you what I'm talking about, not to confuse anybody. If we were talking about a position such as this, where you had the same conundrum that you were not able to get the Philidor, these positions would never be too difficult because the long side is so long that even the B file is enough. Even with your opponent's rook controlling the A file, the white king does not have enough space to get to you and protect the pawn. So in the case of a bishop pawn, the king on short side, rook on long side is the perfect recipe. Even in the case of our original position, which was this, the rooks being on the different squares, even in the case of our original position, the critical idea of transferring your king to the short side is all you need to know to draw. And remembering that if your rook had endless space, you would have a million checks and you would be able to draw every time. So the only difficulty becomes when we're in a position that our opponent controls the A file. A hard thing to anticipate when you're talking about, let's say, 20 moves ago when you transferred into this rook ending. But hopefully watching this video will give you some of that knowledge, and you may be able to see the writing on the wall before it happens, which would obviously be a very useful thing. Or, of course, in the case that you're trying to win this endgame, you now understand that even if your opponent seems to have a clear head on his shoulders about getting his king to the short side and his rook on the long side, if you've managed to get control over this A file, you will still be able to win because the long side is not enough. Okay, very good. One last thing to cover, and I think it is a critical point. Not a point that's talked about very often. It's called second Philidor defense, and something that I forget from time to time when I'm teaching, forget even to mention this idea. But let's say we're in this position, the one that should be a draw, as you notice, because this rook is not on the A file, he's on the B file. So by coming forward, he's going to lead us right into a position where our rook is far enough away from the pawn, as you've noticed. However, what if he comes forward and in this moment tries to go back to the A file? What if he takes that extra time? What do we do here? Well, going over to the B file isn't going to help us because, as we already know, the B file generally isn't long enough, going to make this kind of tricky to draw. But another idea to be aware of, another drawing idea to be aware of, is what we call second Philidor defense, and that is, when the rook grabs the A file, and that is bringing your rook behind the pawn. Now, you're behind the pawn, and the pawn's still on the 5th rank, which usually isn't good enough because that means his king is on the 6th rank. However, in this particular position, that extra time he's taken has given us an extra move to get behind the pawn. And what you're going to see here is that when he gives check and comes forward, he can't simply come forward anymore because of the pawn. If he goes to D6 trying to clear the way, our king can come to F7 guarding the square, and checks don't make a difference. Checks do nothing but put us back in this position. Obviously, pushing this pawn, we're immediately in the Philidor situation where we can start giving checks. And repeating this little recipe with the rook is not going to make a difference. His only real trick to try is back in this position, trying to bring the rook in front of the pawn to guard it in order that he can move the king and immediately start pushing. However, what do you notice when he leaves the A file? Oh, now we're in the long side position again, and all of a sudden the fact that he had control over the A file doesn't make a difference anymore. The game is now a draw again. Our rook is on the long side. Let's review that idea one more time because it's a little bit tricky. But a very important point to be aware of is that if your opponent is not in control over the A file, but tries to get control over the A file, the second Philidor defense, as it's called, I think that's the name of it, is to put the rook behind the pawn when he takes that extra move. And because your rook is in the optimal situation here, you have this key defense that when the king slides over, your king gets there just in time, and he's unable to make progress. Again, checks make no difference, and if he ever is to push the pawn without having his king protected, you know what happens there. We unleash the floodgates and the Philidor checks start. Check, 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 and when the king has no place to hide, we have nothing to worry about. Too many squares away, leading to a draw. Okay, so this is going to include our video on the basic ideas of king on short side, rook on long side. I say basic, but please don't take it that way. I could probably name many experts and almost near masters I've run across who don't fully understand these ideas. They are very complicated. And even in practical games, very good players have blown these positions, including grandmasters. And you can see why. The trickiness of remembering all the different positions of the rooks and the ideas of how to hide your king, especially when the practical consideration of time pressure comes into play. These can be very difficult things to do over the board. So hopefully watching this video has improved your understanding of that. And remember the key phrases: king on short side, rook on long side. And one more time, just so we can see my favorite phrase that rhymes. If he tries to make a trade of the rooks, we are going to do what? We are going to wait on the 8th. It rhymes. So you put your king on the short side, the rook on the long side, and you wait on the 8th. And a very good recipe to knowing how to draw these, although not always a draw. If your opponent is in control over the open file, still the best you can do is have this knowledge, and hopefully it comes into play in your game. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the video.